Hello, welcome to this channel, an.vanhofstade. If you are new here, welcome. And if you are coming back, welcome back. We are going to read further on chapter 17 of Persuasion by Jane Austen. While Sir Walter and Elizabeth were assiduously pushing their good fortune in Laura Place, Anne was renewing an acquaintance of the different description. She had called on her former governess, and had heard from her of there being an old school fellow in Bath, who had two strong claims on her attention, of past kindness and present suffering. Miss Hamilton, now Mrs. Smith, had shown her kindness in one of those periods of her life when it had been most valuable. Anne had gone unhappy to school, grieving for the loss of a mother whom she had dearly loved, feeling her separation from home, and suffering as a girl of 14, of strong sensibility and not high spirits, must suffer at such a time. A Miss Hamilton, 3 years older than herself, but still, from the want of new relations and a settled home, remaining another year at school, had been useful and good to her in a way which had considerably lessened her misery, and could never be remembered with difference. Miss Hamilton had left school, had married not long afterwards. She was said to have married a man of fortune, and this was all that Anne had known of her. Till now, that their governess account brought her situation forward in a more decided but very different form. She was a widow and poor. Her husband had been extravagant, and at his death about 2 years before, had left his affairs dreadfully involved. She had had difficulties of every sort to contend with, and in addition to these distresses, had been afflicted with a severe rheumatic fever, which finally, settling in her legs, had made her for the present a cripple. She had come to Bath on that account, and was now in lodgings near the Heath Baths, living in a very humble way, unable even to afford herself the comfort of a servant, and of course almost excluded from society. Their mutual friend answered for the satisfaction which a visit for Miss Elliot would give Mrs. Smith, and Anne therefore lost no time in going. She mentioned nothing of what she had heard or what she intended at home. It would excite no proper interest there. The only consulted, she only consulted Lady Russell, who entered thoroughly into her sentiments, and was most happy to convey her as near to Mrs. Smith's lodgings in Westgate Buildings as Anne chose to be taken. The visit was paid, their acquaintance re-established, their interest in each other more than rekindled. The first 10 minutes had its awkwardness and its emotion. 12 years were gone since they had parted, and each presented a somewhat different person from what the other had imagined. 12 years had changed Anne from the blooming, silent, unformed girl of 15 to the elegant little woman of 27, with very beauty, with every beauty excepting bloom, and with manners as consciously right as they were invariably gentle. And 12 years had transformed the fine-looking, well-grown Miss Hamilton in all the glow of health and confidence of superiority into a poor, infirm, helpless widow, receiving the visit of her former protégé as a favor. But all that was uncomfortable in the meeting had soon passed away, and left only the interesting charm of remembering former partialities and talking over old times. Anne found in Mrs. Smith the good sense and agreeable manners which she had almost ventured to depend on, and on disposition to converse and be cheerful beyond her expectation. Neither the dissipations of the past, and she had lived very much in the world, nor the restrictions of the present, neither sickness nor sorrow, seemed to have closed her heart or ruined her spirits. In the course of a second visit, she talked with great openness, and Anne's astonishment increased. She could scarcely imagine a more cheerless situation in itself than Mrs. Smith. She had been very fond of her husband. She had buried him. She had been used to affluence. It was gone. She had no child to connect her with life and happiness again, no relations to assist in the arrangement of perplexed affairs, no help to make all the rest supportable. Her accommodations were limited to a noisy parlor and a dark bedroom behind, with no possibility of moving from one to the other without assistance, which there was only one servant in the house to afford, and she never quitted the house but to be conveyed into the warm bath. Yet, in spite of all this, Anne had reason to believe that she had moments only of languor and depression to hours of occupation and enjoyment. How could it be? She watched, observed, reflected, and finally determined that this was not a case of fortitude or resignation only. A submissive spirit might be patient. A strong understanding would supply resolution. But here was something more. Here was that elasticity of mind, that disposition to be comforted, the power of turning readily from evil to good, and of finding employment which carried her out of herself, which was from nature alone, was the choicest gift of heaven. And Anne viewed her friend as one of those instances in which, by a merciful appointment, it seems designed to counterbalance almost every other want. There had been a time, Mrs. Smith told her, when her spirits had nearly failed. She could not call herself an invalid now, compared with her state in the first reaching bath. Then she had indeed been a pitiable object, for she had caught cold on the journey and had hardly taken possession of her lodgings before she was again confined to her bed, and suffering under severe and constant pain, and all this among strangers, with the absolute necessity of having a regular nurse, and finances at that moment particularly unfit to meet any extraordinary expense. She had weathered it, however, and could truly say that it had done her good. It had increased her comforts by making her feel herself to be in good hands. She had seen too much of the world to expect sudden or disinterested attachment anywhere. But her illness had proved to her that her landlady had a character to preserve and would not use her ill, and she had been particularly fortunate in her nurse, a sister of her landlady, a nurse by profession, and who had always a home in that house when unemployed, chanced to be at a liberty just in time to attend her. And she said, Mrs. Smith, besides nursing me most admirably, has really proved an invaluable acquaintance. As soon as I could use my hands, she taught me to knit, which had been a great amusement, and she kept me in the way of making these little thread cases, pin cushions, and card racks, which you always find me so busy about, and which supply me with the means of doing a little good to one or two very poor families in this neighborhood. She has a large acquaintance, of course, professionally, among those who can afford to buy, and she disposes of my merchandise. She always takes the right time for applying. Everybody's heart is open, you know, when they have recently escaped from severe pain or are recovering the blessings of health. And Nurse Rook thoroughly understands when to speak. She is a shrewd, intelligent, sensible woman. Hers is a line for seeing human nature, and she has a fund of good sense and observation, which as a companion make her infinitely superior to thousands of those who, having only received the best education in the world, know nothing worth attending to. Call it gossip, if you will. But when Nurse Rook has a half an hour's leisure to bestow on me, she is sure to have something to relate that is entertaining and profitable, something that makes one knows one's species better. One likes to hear what is going on, to be au fait to the newest modes of being trifling and silly. To me, who live so much alone, her conversation, I assure you, is a treat. Anne, far from wishing to cavil at the pleasure, replied, I can easily believe it. Women of that class have great opportunities, and if they are intelligent, may be well worth listening to. Such varieties of human nature as they are in the habit of witnessing. And it is not merely in its follies that they are well read, for they see it occasionally under every circumstance that can be almost interesting or affecting. What instances must pass before them of ardent, disinterested, self denying attachment, of heroism, fortitude, patience, resignation, of all the conflicts and all the sacrifices that ennoble us most. A sick chamber may often furnish the worth of volumes. Yes, said Mrs. Smith more doubtingly. Sometimes it may, though I fear its lessons are not often in the elevated style you describe. Here and there, human nature may be great in times of trial, but generally speaking, its, it is its weakness and not its strength that appears in a sick chamber. It is selfishness and impatience rather than generosity and fortitude that one hears of. There is so little real friendship in the world, and unfortunately, speaking low and tremulously, There are so many who forget to think seriously till it is almost too late. Anne saw a misery of such feelings. The husband had not been what he ought, and the wife had been let among that part of mankind which make her think worse of the world than she hoped it deserved. It was but a passing emotion, however, with Mrs. Smith. She shook it off, and soon added in a different tone, "I do not suppose the situation my friend Mrs. Roke is in at present will furnish much either to interest or edify me. She is only nursing Mrs. Wallace of Marlborough Buildings, a rare, pretty, silly, expensive, fashionable woman, I believe, and of course will have nothing to report but of lace and finery. I mean to make my profit of Mrs. Wallace, however. She has plenty of money, and I intend she shall buy all the high-priced things I have in hand now." Anne had called several times on her friend before the existence of such a person was known in Camden Place. At last it became necessary to speak of her. Sir Walter, Elizabeth, and Mrs. Clay returned one morning from Laura Place with a sudden invitation from Lady Dalrymple for the same evening, and Anne was already engaged to spend that evening in Westgate Buildings. She was not sorry for the excuse. They were only asked, she was sure, because Lady Dalrymple, being kept at home by a bad cold, was glad to make use of the relationship which had been so pressed on her, and she declined on her own account with great alacrity. She was engaged to spend the evening with an old schoolfellow. They were not much interested in anything relative to Anne, but still there were questions enough asked to make it understood what this old schoolfellow was, and Elizabeth was disdainful, and Sir Walter severe. "Westgate Buildings?" said he. "And who is Miss Anne Elliot to be visiting in Westgate Buildings?" "A Mrs. Smith, a widow Mrs. Smith, and who was her husband, one of the 5,000 Mr. Smiths, whose names are to be met with everywhere. And what is her attraction? That she is old and sickly. Upon my word, Miss Anne Elliot have had the most extraordinary taste. Everything that revolts other people, low company, paltry rooms, foul air, disgusting associations are inviting to you. But surely you may put off this old lady till tomorrow. She is not so near her, and I presume but that they may hope to see another day. What is her age? 40? No, sir, she is not 1 and 30, but I do not think I can put off my engagement, because it is the only evening for some time which will at once suit her and myself. She goes into the warm bath tomorrow, and for the rest of the week, we are engaged. But what does Lady Russell think of this acquaintance? Asked Elizabeth. She sees nothing to blame in it, replied Anne. On the contrary, she approves it, and has generally taken me when I have called on Mrs. Smith. Westgate Buildings must have been rather surprised by the appearance of a carriage drawn up near its pavement, observed Sir Walter. Sir Henry Russell's widow, indeed, has no honours to distinguish her arms, but still it is a handsome equipage, and no doubt it will known to convey a Miss Elliot, a widow, Mrs. Smith's lodging in Westgate Buildings, a poor widow barely able to live without 30 and 40, a mere Mrs. Smith, and every day Mrs. Smith, of all people and all names in the world, to be the chosen friend of Miss Anne Elliot, and to be preferred by her to her own family connections among the nobility of England and Ireland. Mrs. Smith, such a name. Mrs. Clay, who had been present while all this passed, now thought it advisable to leave the room, and Anne could have said much, and did long to say a little, in defence of her friends, not very dissimilar claims to theirs, but her friends, but her sense of personal respect to her father prevented her. She made no reply. She left it to she left it to himself to recollect that Mrs. Smith was not the only widow in Bath between 30 and 40, with little to live on and no surname of dignity. Anne kept her appointment, and the others kept theirs, and of course she heard the next morning that they had had a delightful evening. She had been the only one of the set absent, for Sir Walter and Elizabeth had not only been quite at her ladyship's service themselves, but had actually been happy to be employed by her in collecting others, and had been at the trouble of inviting both Lady Russell and Mr. Elliot. And Mr. Elliot had made a point of leaving Colonel Wallis early, and Lady Russell had fresh arranged all her evening engagement in order to wait on her, and had the whole history of all that such an evening could supply, from Lady Russell. To her, its greatest interest must be in having been very much talked of between her friend and Mr. Elliot, in having been wished for, regretted, and at the same time honored for staying away in such a cause. Her kind, compassionate visits to this old school fellow, sick and reduced, seemed to have quite delighted Mr. Elliot. He thought her as a most extraordinary young woman, in her temper, manners, mind, a model of female excellence. He could meet even Lady Russell in discussion of her merits, and Anne could not be given to understand so much by her friend, and could not know herself to be so highly rated by a sensible man without many of those agreeable sensations which her friend meant to create. Lady Russell was now perfectly decided in her opinion of Mr. Elliot. She was as much convinced of his meaning to gain Anne in all time, as of his deserving her, and was beginning to calculate the number of weeks which would free him from all the remaining restraints of widowhood, and leave him at liberty to speak, to exert his most open powers of pleasing. She would not speak to Anne with half the certainty she felt on the subject. She was venture, she would venture on little more than hints of what might be hereafter, of a possible attachment on his side, of the desirableness of the alliance. Supposing such an attachment to be healed and returned, Anne heard her, and made no violent exclamation. She only smiled, blushed, and gently shook her head. "I am no matchmaker, as you well know," said Lady Russell, being much too well aware of the uncertainty of all human events and calculations. "I only mean that if Mr. Elliot should some time hence pay his addresses to you, and if you should be disposed to accept him, I think there would be a very possibility of you being happy together." "A most suitable connection, everybody must consider it, but I think it might be a very happy one. Mr. Elliot is an exceedingly agreeable man, and in many respects I think highly of him," said Anne. "But we should not suit." Lady Russell let this pass, and only said in rejoinder, "I own that to be able to regard you as a future mistress of Gillinge, the future Lady Elliot, to look forward and see you occupying your dear mother's place, succeeding to all her rights and all her popularity, as well as to all her virtues, would be the highest possible gratification to me. You are your mother's self in countenance and disposition, and if I might be allowed to fancy you such as she was, in situation and name and home, presiding and blessing in the same spot, and only superior to her in being more highly valued, my dearest Anne, it would give me more delight than is often felt at my time of life Anne was obliged to turn away, to rise, to walk to a distant table, and leaning there in pretended employment, try to subdue the feelings this picture excited. For a few moments her imagination and her heart were bewitched. The idea of becoming what late her mother had been, of having the precious name of Lady Elliot first revived in herself, of being restored to Kellynch, calling it her home again, her home forever, was a charm which she could not immediately resist. Lady Russell said not another word, willing to leave the matter to its own operation, and believing that could Mr. Elliot at that moment with propriety have spoken for himself. She believed, in short, what Anne did not believe. The same image of Mr. Elliot speaking for himself brought Anne to composure again. The charm of Kellynch and of Lady Elliot all faded away. She never could accept him, and it was not only that her feelings were still adverse to any man save one. Her judgment, on a serious consideration of the possibilities of such a case, was against Mr. Elliot. Though they had now been acquainted a month, she could not be satisfied that she really knew his character, that he was a sensible man, an agreeable man, that he talked well, professed good opinions, seemed to judge properly, and as a man of principle, this was all clear enough. He certainly knew what was right, nor could she fix on any one article of moral duty, evidently transgressed, but yet she would have been afraid to answer for it, for his conduct. She distrusted the past, if not the present. The names which occasionally drop off former associates, the allusions to former practices and pursuits, suggested suspicions not of favorable of what he had been. She saw that there had been bad habits, that Sunday travelling had been a common thing, that there had been a period of his life, and probably not a short one, when he had been at least careless on all serious matters. And though he might now think very differently, who could answer for the true sentiments of a clever, cautious man, grown old enough to appreciate a fair character? How could it ever be ascertained that his mind was truly cleansed? Mr. Elliot was rational, discreet, polished, but he was not open. There was never any burst of feelings, any warmth of indignation or delight at the evil or good of others. This to Anne was a decided imperfection. Her early impressions Elliot's were incurable. She prized the frank, the open-hearted, and eager character beyond all others. Warmth and enthusiasm did captivate her still. She felt that she could so much more depend upon the sincerity of those who sometimes look or said a careless or a hasty thing, than of those whose presence of mind never varied, whose tongue never slipped. Mr. Elliot was too generally agreeable. Various as were the tempers in her father's house, he pleased them all. He endured too well, stood too well with everybody. He had spoken to her with some degree of openness of Mrs. Clay, had appeared completely to see what Mrs. Clay was about, and to hold her in contempt. And yet Mrs. Clay found him as agreeable as anybody. Lady Russell saw either less or more than her young friend, for she saw nothing to excite distrust. She could not imagine a man more exactly what he ought to be than Mr. Elliot, nor did she ever enjoy a sweeter feeling than the hope of seeing him receive the hand of her beloved Anne in Killing's Church in the course of the following autumn. That was the end of chapter 17, Persuasion by Jane Austen. Now, we will continue to chapter 18. It was the beginning of February, and Anne, having been a month in Bath, was growing very eager for news from Uppercross and Lyme. She wanted to hear much more than Mary communicated. It was 3 weeks since she had heard at all. She only knew that Henrietta was at home again, and that Louisa, though considered to be recovering fast, was still at Lyme. And she was thinking of them all very intently one evening, when a thicker letter than usual from Mary was delivered to her, and to quicken the pleasure and surprise with Admiral and Mrs. Croft's compliments. The Crofts must be in Bath, a circumstance to interest her. They were people whom her heart turned to very naturally. "What is this?" cried Sir Walter. "The Crofts arrived in Bath? The Crofts who rent Killingst? What have they brought you?" "A letter from Uppercross Cottage, sir." "Oh, those letters are convenient passports. They secure an introduction. I should have visited Admiral Croft. However, at any rate, I know what is due to my tenant." Anne could listen no longer. She could not even have told how the poor Admiral's complexion escaped. Her letter engrossed her. It had been begun several days back. February 1st. My dear Anne, I make no apology for my silence, because I know how little people think of letters in such a place as Bath. You must be a great deal too happy to care for Uppercross, which, as you knew now, affords little to write about. We have had a very dull Christmas. Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove have not had one dinner party all the holidays. I do not reckon the Hayters as anybody. The holidays, however, are over at last. I believe no children ever had such long ones. I am sure I had not. The house was cleared yesterday, except of the little Harvilles, but you will be surprised to hear that they have never gone home. Mrs. Harville must be an odd mother to part with her so long. I do not understand it. They are not at all nice children, in my opinion. But Mrs. Musgrove seems to like them quite as well, if not better than her grandchildren. What dreadful weather we have had! It may not be felt in Bath with your nice pavements, but in the country it is of some consequence. I have not had a creature call on me since the second week in January, except Charles Hayter, who has been calling much oftener than was welcome. Between ourselves, I think it is a great pity Henrietta did not remain at Lyme as long as Louisa. It would have kept her a little out of his way. The carriage is gone today to bring Louisa, and the Harvilles tomorrow. We are not asked to dine with them, however, till the day after. Mrs. Musgrove is so afraid of her being fatigued by the journey, which is not very likely, considering the case that will be taken of her. And it would be much more convenient to me to dine there tomorrow. I am glad you find Mr. Elliot so agreeable, and wish I could be acquainted with him, too. But I have my usual luck. I'm always out of the way when my thing desirable is going on. Always the last of my family to be noticed. What an immense time Mrs. Clay had been staying with Elizabeth. Does she never mean to go away? But perhaps if she were to leave the room vacant, we might not be invited. Let me know what you think of this. I do not expect my children to be asked. You know, I can leave them at Great House very well for a month or 6 weeks. I have this moment heard that the Crofts are going to Bath, because immediately they think the Admiral guilty. Charles heard it quite by chance. They had not they had they have not had the civility to give me any notice or offer to take anything. I do not think they improve at all as neighbors. We see nothing of them. This is really an instance of gross inattention. Charles joins me in love and everything proper. Yours affectionately, Mary M. I am sorry to say that I am very far from well, and Jemima had just told me that the butcher says there is a bad sore throat very much about. I dare say I shall catch it, and my sore throats, as always, worse than anybody's. So ended the first part, which had been afterwards put into an envelope containing nearly as much more. I kept my letter open, that I might send you word how Louisa bore her journey, and now I am extremely glad I did, having a great deal to add. In the first place, I had note from Mrs. Croft yesterday, offering to convey anything to you. A very kind, friendly note indeed, addressed to me, just as it ought. It shall therefore be able to make my letter as long as I like. The Admiral does not seem very ill, and I sincerely hope Bath will do him all the good he wants. I shall be truly glad to have them back again. Our neighborhood cannot spare such a pleasanter family. But now for Louisa, I have something to communicate that will astonish you not a little. She and the Harbels came on Tuesday very safely, and in the evening we went to ask her how she did when she were rather surprised not to find Captain Benwick of the party, for he had been invited as well as the Harvilles. And what do you think was the reason? Neither more or less than his being in love with Louisa, and not choosing to venture to Uppercross till he had had an answer from Mr. Musgrove, for it was all settled between him and her before she came away, and he had written to her father by Captain Harville. True, upon my honor. Are not you astonished? I shall be surprised, at least, if you ever receive a hint of it, for I never did. Mrs. Musgrove protests solemnly that she knew nothing of the matter. We are all very well pleased, however, for though it is not equal to her marrying Captain Wentworth, it is infinitely better than Charles Hayter. And Mrs. Musgrove had written his Mr. Musgrove had written his consent, and Captain Benwick is expected today. Mrs. Harble says her husband feels a good deal on his poor little sister's account. But however, Louisa is a great favourite with both. Indeed, Mrs. Harble and I quite agree that we love her the better for having nursed her. Charles wonders what Captain Wentworth will say, but if you remember, I never thought him attached to Louisa. I never could see anything of it. And this is the end, you see, of Captain Benwick's being supposed to be an admirer of yours. How Charles could take such a thing into his head was always incomprehensible to me. I hope he will be more agreeable now. Certainly not a great match for Louisa Musgrove, but a million times better than marrying among the haters. Mary did not have feared her sisters being in any degree prepared for the news. She had never in her life been more astonished. Captain Benwick and Louisa Musgrove. It was almost too wonderful for belief, and it was with the greatest effort that she could remain in the room, preserved an air of calmness, and answer the common questions of the moment. Happily for her, they were not many. Sir Walter wanted to know whether the Crofts travelled with 4 horses, and whether they were likely to be situated in such a part of Bath as it might suit Miss Elliot and himself to visit in, but had little curiosity beyond. "How is Mary?" said Elizabeth, and without waiting for an answer. "And pray what brings the Crofts to Bath?" "They come on the Admiral's account. He is thought to be gouty." "Gout! And discrepitude," said Sir Walter. "Poor old gentleman." "Have they any acquaintance here?" asked Elizabeth. "I do not know, but I can hardly suppose that at Admiral Croft's time of life, and in his position, he should not have many acquaintance in such a place as this." "I suspect," said Sir Walter, coolly, "that Admiral Croft will be best known in Bath as the renter of Kellynch Hall. Elizabeth maybe venture to present him and his wife in Laura's place." "Oh no, I think not. Situated as we are with Lady Dalrymple, cousins, we ought to be very careful not to embarrass her with acquaintance she might not approve. If we were not related, it would not such signify, but as cousins, she would feel scrupulous as to any poor proposal of ours. We had better leave the Crofts to find their own level. There are several odd-looking men walking around about here, who, I am told, are sailors. The Crofts will associate with them." This was Sir Walter and Elizabeth's share of interest in the letter. When Mrs. Clay had paid her tribute of more distant attention in an inquiry after Mrs. Charles Musgrove and her fine little boys, Anne was at liberty. In her own room, she tried to comprehend it. Well, might Charles wonder how Captain Wentworth would feel. Perhaps he had quitted the field, had given Louisa up, had ceased to love, had found he did not love her. She could not endure the idea of treachery or levity, or anything akin to ill usage, between him and his friend. She could not endure that such a friendship as theirs should be severed unfairly. Captain Benwick and Louisa Musgrove. The high-spirited, joyous-talking Louisa Musgrove and the dejected, thinking, feeling, reading Captain Benwick seemed each of them everything that would not suit the other. Their minds most dissimilar. Where could have been the attraction? The answer soon presented itself, and it had been in situation. They had been thrown together several weeks. They had been living on the same small family party since Henrietta's coming home. They must have been depending almost entirely on each other. And Louisa, just recovered from illness, had been in an interesting state, and Captain Benwick was not inconsolable. That was a point which Anne had not been able to avoid suspecting before, and instead of drawing the same conclusion as Mary from the present course of events, they served only to confirm the idea of his having felt some drowning of tenderness towards herself. She did not mean, however, to derive much more from it to gratify her vanity than Mary would have allowed. She was persuaded that any tolerably pleasing young man who had listened and seemed to feel for him would have received the same compliment. He had an affectionate heart. He must love somebody. She saw no reason against their being happy. Louisa had fine novel fervour to begin with, and they would soon grow more alike. He would gain cheerfulness, and she would learn to be an enthusiast from Scott and Lord Byron. Nay, that was probably learned journey already. Of course, they had fallen in love over poetry. The idea of Louisa Musgrove turned into a person of literary taste and sentimental reflection was amusing, but she had not doubt of its being so. The day at Lyme, the fall from the cup, might influence her health, her nerves, her courage, her character, to the end of her life, as thoroughly as it appeared to have influenced her life. The conclusion of the whole was that if the woman, who had been sensible of Captain Wentworth's merits, would could be allowed to prefer another man, there was nothing in the engagement to excite lasting wonder. and if Captain Wentworth lost no friend by it, certainly nothing to be regretted. No, it was not regret which made Anne's heart beat in spite of herself and brought color into her cheeks when she thought of Captain Wentworth. Unshackled and free, she had some feelings which she was ashamed to investigate. They were too much like joy, senseless joy. She longed to see the Crofts, but when the meeting took place, it was evident that no rumor of the news had yet reached them. The visit of ceremony was paid and returned, and Louisa Musgrove was mentioned, and Captain Benwick too, without even half a smile. The Crofts had placed themselves in lodgings in Gay Street, perfectly to Sir Walter's satisfaction. He was not at all ashamed of the acquaintance, and did in fact think and talk a great deal more about the Admiral than the Admiral ever thought or talked about him. The Crofts knew quite as many people in Bath as they wished for, and considered their intercourse with the Elliots as a mere matter of form, and not in the least likely to afford them any pleasure. They brought with them their country habit of being always together. He was ordered to walk to keep off the gout, and Mrs. Croft seemed to go shares with him in everything and to walk for her life to do him good, and saw them wherever she went. Lady Russell took her out in her carriage almost every morning, and she never failed to think of them, and never failed to see them. Knowing their feelings as she did, it was a most attractive picture of happiness to her. She always watched them as long as she could, delighted to fancy she understood what they might be talking of, as they walked along in happy independence, or equally delighted to see the Admiral's hearty shake of the hand when he recommended an old friend, and observe their eagerness of conversation when occasionally forming into a little knot of the navy, Mrs. Croft looking as intelligent and keen as any of the officers around her. Anne was too much engaged with Lady Russell to be often walking herself, but it is so happened that one morning, about 2 weeks or 10 days after the Crofts' arrival, it suited her best to leave her friend or her friend's carriage and in the lower part of the town, and return alone to Camden Place, and in walking up Milsom Street, she had the good fortune to meet with the Admiral. He was standing by himself at a print shop window, with his hands behind him, an earnest contemplation of some point, and she not only might have passed him unseen, but was obliged to touch as well as address him before she could catch his notice. When he did perceive and acknowledge her, however, it was done with all this unusual frankness and good humour. "Ha! It is you. Thank you, thank you. This is treating me like a friend. Here I am, you seeing, staring at the picture. I can never get by this shop without stopping. But what a thing here is, by way of a boat. Do look at it. Did you ever see the like? The queer fellows your fine painters must be, to think that anybody would venture their lives in such a shapeless odd cockless shell as this. Yet there are two gentlemen stuck up in it mightily at their ease, and looking about them at the rocks and mountains, as if they were not to be upset the next moment, which they certainly must be. I wonder where that boat was built, laughing heartily. I would not venture over a horse pond in it. Well, turning away now, where are you bound? Can I go anywhere for you, or with you? Can I be of any use? None, thank you, unless you will give me the pleasure of your company the little way our road lies together. I am going home. That I will, with all my heart, and farther too. Yes, yes, we will have a snug walk together, and I have something to tell you as we go along. Were there in my arm? That's right. I do not feel comfortable if I have not a woman there. Lord, what a boast it is, taking a last look at the picture. As they began to be in motion, did you say that you had something to tell me, sir? Yes, I have, presently. But there, but here comes a friend, Captain Bridgden. I shall only say, how do you do, as we pass. However, I shall not stop. How do you do? Bridgen stares to see anybody with me but my wife. She, poor soul, is tied by the leg. She has a blister on one of her heels, as large as a 3 shillings piece. If you look across the street, you will see Admiral Brand coming down and his brother chubby fellows, both of them. I am glad they are not on this side of the way. Sophie cannot bear them. They played me a pitiful trick once, got away some of my best men. I will tell you the whole story another time. There comes old Sir Archibald Drew and his grandson. Look, he sees us. He kisses his hand to you. He takes you for my wife. Ah, the peace had come too soon for that younker. Poor old Sir Archibald. How do you like Bath, Miss Elliot? It suits us very well. We are always meeting with some old friend or another. The streets full of them every morning, sure to have plenty of chat. and then we get away from them all and shut ourselves into our lodgings and draw in our chairs and are snug as if we were at Killinge. A, or as we used to be even at North Yarmouth and Deal. We do not like our lodgings here the worst. I can tell you for putting us in the mind of those we first had at North Yarmouth. The wind blows through one of the cupboards just in the same way. When they got when they were cut a little further, Anne ventured to press again for what he had to communicate. She had dropped she had hoped when clear of Milson Street to have her curiosity gratified, but she was still obliged to wait, for the Admiral had made up his mind not to begin till they had gained the further space and quiet of Bilmouth, and as she was not really Mrs. Croft, she must let him have his own way. As soon as they were fairly ascending Belmont, he began. Well, I know you shall hear something that will surprise you. First of all, you must tell me the name of the young lady I am going to talk to. The young lady, you know, that we have all been so concerned for. The Miss Musgrove that all this has been happening to. Her Christian name. I always forgot her Christian name. Anne had been ashamed to appear to comprehend as soon as she really did, but now she could safely suggest the name of Louisa. Miss Louisa Musgrove? That is the name. I wish you young ladies had not such a number of fine Christian names. I should never be out if they were all Sophies or something of that sort. Well, this Miss Louisa, we all thought, was to marry Frederick. He was courting her 1 week after. The only wonder was what they could be watching for all the businesses at Lyme came. Then indeed it was clear enough that they must wait till her brain was set to right. But even then, there was nothing odd in their way of going on. Instead of staying at Lyme, he went off to Plymouth, and then he went off to see Edward. When we came back from Minehead, he was gone down to Edward's, and there he has been ever since. We have seen nothing of him since November. Even Sophie could not understand it. But now the matter has taken the strangest turn of all. For this young lady, this same Miss Musgrove, instead of being to marry Frederick, is to marry James Benwick. You know, James Benwick. A little. I am quite acquainted with with Captain Benwick. Well, she is to marry him. Nay, most likely they are married already, for I do not know what they should wait for. I thought Captain Benwick a very pleasing young man, said Anne, and I can understand that he bears an excellent character. Oh, yes, yes, there is a word to be said against James Benwick. He is only a commander, it is true, made last summer, and these are bad times for getting on. But he has not another fault that I know of. An excellent, good-hearted fellow, I assure you, a very active, zealous officer too, which is more than you could think of for. Perhaps, for that soft sort of manner does not do him justice. Indeed, you are mistaken there, sir. I should never augur want of spirit from Captain Benwick's manners. I thought them particularly pleasing, and I will answer for it, they would generally please. Well, well, ladies are the best judges, but Captain Benwick is rather too piano for me, and though very likely it is all our partiality, Sophie and I cannot help thinking Frederick's manners better than his. There is something about Frederick more to our taste. Anne was caught. She had only meant to oppose the too common idea of spirit and gentleness being incompatible with each other, not at all to represent Captain Benwick's manners as the very best that could possibly be. And, after a little hesitation, she was beginning to say, I was not entering into any comparison of the two friends, but Admiral interrupted her with, and the thing is certainly true. This is not a mere bit of gossip. We have it from Frederick himself. His sister had a letter from him yesterday, in which he tells us of it, and he had just had it in a letter from Harville, written upon the spot from Uppercross. I fancy they are all at Uppercross. This was not an opportunity which Anne could not resist. She said, therefore, I hope, Admiral, I hope there is nothing in the style of Captain Wentworth's letter to make you and Mrs. Crofts particularly uneasy. It did not certainly seem, last autumn, as if there were an attachment between him and Louisa Musgrove. But I hope it may be understood to have worn out on each side equally, and without violence. I hope this letter does not breathe the spirit of an ill-used man. Not at all, not at all. There is not an oath or a murmur from beginning to end. Anne looked down to hide her smile. No, no, Frederick is not a man to whine and complain. He has too much spirit for that. If the girl likes another man better, it is very it is very fit she should have him. Certainly, but what I mean is that I hope there is nothing in Captain Wentworth's manner of writing to make you suppose he thinks himself ill-used by his friend, which might appear, you know, without its being absolutely said. I thought be every sorry that such a friendship as had subsided between him and Captain Benwick should be destroyed or even wounded by a circumstance of this sort. Yes, yes, I understand you, but there is nothing at it all of that nature in the letter. He does not give the least fling at Benwick, does not so much as say, I wonder at it. I have a reason of my own for wondering at it. No, you would not guess, from this way of writing, that he had ever thought of this Miss, what's her name, for himself. He simply handsomely hopes they will be happy together, and there is nothing very unforgiving in that, I think. Anne did not receive the perfect conviction which the Admiral meant to convey, but it would have been useless to press the inquiry further. She therefore satisfied herself with commonplace remarks, or quiet attention, and the Admiral had it all his own way. Poor Frederick, said he, at last. Now he must begin all over again with somebody else. I think we must get him to Bath. Sophie must write and beg him to come to Bath. Here are pretty girls enough, I am sure. It would be of no use to go to Uppercross again, for that other Miss Musgrove, I find, is bespoke by her cousin, the young parson. Do not you think, Miss Elliot, we better try to get him to Bath? That was the end of chapter 18. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave me a lovely comment, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Do make sure you also click all so you will be notified as soon as I post a new video. Again, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This video would not be noticed or seen without your help. See you on my next video, and goodbye.